Russian Northwoods, they said it was just a fire, a tragic accident in a crumbling Moscow apartment complex on a cold September night in 1999. But what followed would plunge a nation into fear, reshape its government, and begin a war that would leave thousands dead and millions broken. The flames that consumed that building were not just flames, they were signals. Carefully orchestrated beacons in the dark that marked the beginning of something sinister, something calculated deep within. The shadows of the Russian state plans were moving blueprints, written not with ink, but with blood and deception. It was called Operation Northwoods in America decades earlier. But what if Russia had its own version, a false flag, so chilling, so flawless, that it not only convinced a nation to go to war, but to surrender its freedom in the name of security? The story begins not in 1999, but years earlier in the closed offices of the FSB, the successor to the infamous KGB, where men trained in psychological manipulation, surveillance, and subversion sat around polished tables, studying a crumbling federation and wondering how to glue it back together through fear and control. Chechnya was the scapegoat, a republic restless, defiant, and stained with blood. From the First Chechen War in 1994, it had humiliated Russia, but this time, they wouldn't let that happen again. This time, the enemy would not be confronted head-on, but created shaped like clay, and painted with horror. They needed terror, something that would shake the very ground under every Russian's feet, make mothers clutch their children, and demand vengeance. Enter the apartment, bombings, 5 cities, 5 deadly blasts that tore through the hearts of ordinary Russians. Over 300 people killed in their sleep, their homes turned to dust, and echoes of silence spreading across the country, and every time the narrative was the same. Chechens, Chechens, Chechens. The government pointed fingers. The media echoed the message, and the people obeyed out of fear. But cracks began to show in the official story. A 6th bomb, discovered in Ryazan, was found before detonation, and the local police arrested suspects who turned out to be FSB agents caught red-handed. The narrative quickly shifted. It was a drill, they said, a training exercise, but the public wasn't buying it. Too many coincidences, too much fear, and yet instead of investigation, came silence. Instead of outrage came obedience. Vladimir Putin, a little-known ex-KGB officer, rose like a ghost from the smog. He promised justice. He promised security. He promised revenge, and Russia listened. Within weeks, he became acting president. Within months, he launched a second war in Chechnya, this time with full national support, and within a year, he was elected with overwhelming majority, riding a wave of nationalism, terror, and blood. But if the bombings were indeed orchestrated by the state, then what does that say about the system? What does that say about the lives lost, the children crushed under debris, the mothers who never saw morning? If terror can be manufactured, if blood can be currency, then who truly rules the people or the shadows? As the smoke cleared from the rubble of Volgodonsk and Bayansk and Moscow, the faces of the victims disappeared beneath a tidal wave of propaganda. Funerals were televised, flags flew at half-mast, and Putin stood solemn and silent, yet behind closed doors, his voice was anything but quiet. He had learned from the KGB the art of silence, the power of illusion, and now he wielded that knowledge like a sword. While the public mourned, the state prepared not just for war, but for transformation. Fear became a weapon, not only to crush Chechnya, but to mold the Russian soul. Laws were passed that limited dissent, restricted media, and expanded surveillance. Journalists who questioned the bombings, like Anna Politkovskaya, found themselves threatened, followed, and ultimately silenced. Her pen was brave, but not bulletproof, and in 2006, she was murdered in her apartment. The message was clear: truth is dangerous in the new Russia. Meanwhile, the FSB grew stronger, not just in reach, but in confidence. They had executed an operation so precise, so terrifying, that no one dared investigate it deeply. Even Western governments whispered about it in classified meetings, but never spoke publicly, afraid of what it might provoke. Chechnya was bombed into submission, Grozny reduced to ruins, civilians slaughtered under the banner of and yet no one asked how the war began. Not really. The silence was deafening, and in that silence the new Russia was born, stronger, darker, unchallenged. Putin's approval soared because he had delivered vengeance, not justice, control, not democracy. And over time, the memory of those bombings faded, buried under layers of fear, and indoctrination textbooks omitted them. News archives were edited, and entire generations grew up never questioning the official version. But deep in the files of a few brave investigators, fragments of truth remained. Documents leaked, testimonies, hidden interviews with FSB defectors who described the planning, the explosives, the orders, all pointing to a terrifying truth that the Russian state may have declared war on its own people, not for conquest but for obedience. It was the perfect crime, and it worked flawlessly. But the echoes of deception did not stop at Chechnya. They grew, they evolved, they spread like roots through the foundations of the Russian Federation. The strategy had worked too well to abandon state-created terror. As a mechanism of control became doctrine, the blueprints of fear were replicated, modified, and deployed again and again. Sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. The hostage Crisis in the Moscow theater in 2002, where over 100 civilians died after Russian forces pumped a mysterious gas into the building before storming it. Some called it rescue, others called it massacre. Then came Beslan in 2004, when armed militants took over a school holding over 1,000 children hostage for days. The final assault led to the deaths of over 300, many of them children. Official narratives blamed Chechen terrorists again, but eyewitnesses reported strange inconsistencies, reports of explosions from outside the school walls, suggestions of state sabotage, and once again, the investigators were silenced. Evidence. Vanished parents were told to mourn quietly or face consequences. Patterns began to emerge, a formula repeated with cold precision: fear plus tragedy equals loyalty, silence equals survival, and each time, the state grew stronger, each time dissent became more dangerous, and each time, Putin's grip tightened. He had turned Russia into a fortress, not against external enemies, but against internal awakening. Meanwhile, the West watched helpless or complicit, entangled in diplomacy, oil and economic interests to challenge the empire of fear, being built brick by brick, lie by lie, and all the while the Russian people sank deeper into a reality manufactured for them, one where enemies were everywhere, one where trust was a liability and loyalty was survival. The ghosts of the bombings, the hostages, the children of Beslan, all became sacrifices in a game of shadows, a game that no one dared name out loud. With Chechnya subdued and the nation gripped by fear, Putin set his sights beyond Russia's borders. A new kind of warfare was emerging: hybrid warfare, a blend of cyber attacks, misinformation, propaganda, and covert military operations designed to confuse and weaken opponents. From Ukraine to Georgia, Russia deployed tactics that blurred the lines between war and peace. False flags became tools not only to justify internal repression, but to meddle in foreign nations, to rewrite maps and redraw power balances. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a masterstroke of deception, with masked soldiers known as Little Green Men taking control before the world even realized what was happening behind the scenes. A sophisticated information campaign painted Ukraine as a fascist state, threatening Russian speakers, creating fear and division, while the West scrambled to respond. Russia moved swiftly to secure strategic ports, military bases, and influence. In eastern Ukraine, the narrative was clear: Russia was defending its people, its history, and its rightful place on the world stage, but underneath the patriotic veneer lay a continuation of the Northwoods philosophy, a willingness to manipulate truth, manufacture crises, and sacrifice innocence for power. The cyber attacks on election systems in the United States and Europe only added layers to this strategy, showing how far Russia was willing to go to destabilize democracies and shift global power dynamics. But as the world watched, the line between fact and fiction blurred further. Truth became a casualty in this new era of shadow wars and misinformation. And yet inside Russia, the lessons of the past echoed loud and clear. The machinery of fear remained intact, the public's obedience bought with blood and lies, while dissenters vanished into prisons or exile. The Northwoods legacy was alive and thriving in a world where shadows held more power than light. As the years passed, the Russian Northwoods operation evolved from brutal bombings and hostage crises into a complex web of psychological warfare and political manipulation. The Cold War's ghosts still haunted the Kremlin, but the weapons had changed. Now it was about hacking elections, spreading fake news, fomenting division, and eroding trust from within. The Russian people were kept under constant surveillance, their communications monitored, and their movements restricted under the guise of national security. Social media platforms were flooded with bots and trolls, amplifying government propaganda and drowning out dissenting voices. Opposition leaders were jailed, poisoned, or driven into exile. The message was unmistakable: loyalty to Putin meant survival, defiance meant destruction. Meanwhile, the West struggled to comprehend this new form of warfare, often underestimating Russia's capacity for deception and hybrid tactics. The lines between state actors and rogue agents blurred, making retaliation risky and complicated. The lessons of the Russian North operation served as a warning not only to Russia but to the entire world that in the shadows of power, the truth is the first casualty, and the price of obedience is often paid in blood and fear. The story of Russian Northwoods is not just one of bombs and lies, but a chilling reminder of how governments can manipulate fear to control populations, rewrite history, and reshape the world order. For those who dare to dig deeper, the truth remains hidden beneath layers of secrecy, but the shadows whisper their secrets to those willing to listen. And as long as the darkness persists, the legacy of Russian Northwoods will continue to shape the fate of nations and the lives of millions. Asterisk.